Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I am one of your hosts, Derek. With me, as always, is Evan. Good day to you, sir.
And good day to you, sir.
All right, we are back after our for us, quick deviation from the narrative last episode, and we are returning to Genesis. This time with Genesis 2:22.
It could be a quick deviation for those who are listening, because a lot of people tend to binge podcasts.
Oh, could be, yeah.
Because they could be listening to like our backlog and just like flying through this.
That is a possibility for sure.
Maybe this immediately uploaded. So
yeah,
but for those who are going with us in real time, you had to wait a week, and we're sorry.
Yeah, you did. Yeah, sorry about that. Well, not a week, a few days.
A few days. Yeah, there we go.
All righty, here we go. Genesis 2:22. And the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man. Last episode, we talked about this being not a rib, not a side, all that kind of stuff. But
2 weeks ago.
What was that? 2 episodes ago. You're right. Yeah, that's right. I already forgot our deviation. Okay. Last sort of in the stream, the Bible discussion episode. Here, though, I want to start with I think the most interesting part of this verse, really maybe the only part worth discussing, is the word used to describe God's making of woman in this verse. And it's actually translated in almost every other instance as building. And very often it's actually with reference to building an altar or a city. And now that, as we progress here, will become even more interesting when we consider the fact that the offspring of Eve here are Cain and Abel, one of whom builds and uses an altar correctly, and the other who builds a city. Seth is actually described as the offspring of Adam. These two are described specifically as the offspring of Eve, and they build cities and altars. So that's interesting to me. And I'm not sure we can fully get into the importance of the altar city dynamic until we get to those within the narrative, right? That's going to matter more when we get to Cain and Abel. So I don't want to do a full breakdown of that here, because that would be unnecessary. It's just that when we get there, we might look back at this verse again and see that maybe there's a little more here than is initially strikes us, right? But I do think it's instructive to see here that the woman holds the potential for both within her, both the altar and the city. So if we focus again on this idea of what I've been talking about, sort of the feminine perspective, right, being sort of symbolically represented within the woman, then we can also see that it's from the feminine perspective that sort of the potential for both altars and cities comes from. Right, there's something in the feminine approach that leads to the building of altars and the building of cities. But returning again to here specifically and build, that it's interesting, because when you build something, you make something in order to sort of house something within it, right? That's the purpose of building something. So you build a house, let's say not necessarily house something within it for a specific task, let's put it that way, right? You build a bridge so that it can be used to carry things over the water, right? You build a shed for whatever reason. You build a car to transport you. You build things for like a very specific reason.
Functionality is at the core of our concept of building. Oftentimes it's different than creation in that it's not creation is a little bit more, or making even. You wouldn't say you build a piece of art.
Right.
You make one, you create something.
Or you form it.
Or you form it. Exactly. Yeah.
Which we'll get to in a minute when we consider the contrast here.
Yeah. Building is very functional in the way it approaches.
Right. And so we can look here at this difference compared with what we saw previous to this. We see, the human being split in two, right? And in man, we see the forming from dust, but in here we see the building of woman, right? So it leads us, I think, to kind of wonder what really is the difference. Again, we're taking the approach that these words are sort of precious and not wasted and not, spouted out for no reason. Like there's a reason that two different things are described as happening here. So what really is the difference between the formed human that sort of becomes man after he's split in two and the remains are stitched up, right? Like that's the description of man. He's formed, split in two, and then stitched up and tossed over to the side. While from that other side, woman is built, right? So what does this tell us then about gender? Because I do think gender is a part of what's being taught here. I think there's layers. And then likewise, what does it tell us about sort of the ideas of masculinity and femininity, right? Mm-hmm. And again, remembering the story, we are sort of looking at you know, the man and woman in this story at least sort of being those representations of pure masculinity, pure femininity. And I think that's sort of built into the story, at least philosophically, if not genetically. That's what it means for us all to be the offspring of these two. It means that, hey, we all have parts of Adam, parts of Eve, parts of man, parts of woman, part of the masculine, part of the feminine. It's within all of us, what we're going to see represented here. But this is sort of like the pure version, going back to our patterns. These are the pure patterns of masculinity and femininity housed within the sort of pure pattern of man and pure pattern of woman. Mm-hmm. They're sort of archetypal in that way. That to me, returning to our pattern discussion, is kind of what an archetype is, right? It's can be sort of an idea of, well, this is sort of the purest pattern of this thing. So, okay, so looking at this then, and I don't know that this is correct, but I'm just going to describe for me what then I see is significant in the difference here in the use of these two words, right? And the first is that something which is formed, it's not necessarily poorly designed, but it's less intricately designed, right? If we think of, remember the word for formed here was used for the idea of a potter shaping clay, right? And in that there's something more artistic, not so engineered, if you will, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's sort of shaped rather than, you know, we got out the what is CAD, I think is the developer program for architects, you know, that they do all their work in, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And so from this idea, what I see is a thing which is a thing you form or shape, is a thing which is perhaps powerfully useful, and it's kind of broadly applicable, but only when kind of set within a specific use and context. So I think of something like wood, right? Wood is something we shape. Wood's not something we design necessarily. We may use it in the process of designing, but we don't design wood. We shape wood to fit something. And wood is strong, sturdy. It can be molded to a variety of uses. It's very simple, but full of potential. And but it must be sort of cultivated and put in the right position in place in order for it to really, you know, reach the potential of what wood can be, if that makes sense. So am I saying that man then, you know, the archetypal man is powerful yet simple? Yes, I am. I think if we look at man, there's a couple different things to see there. First of all, if we look at the male biology, while all human biology is complex, it is generally understood to be far simpler than female sort of physiology, right?
Oh, that's
the male biology is absolutely simpler. Also generally understood to be more powerful too, right? On average, it just is, and can be sort of thus thrown into a variety of situations, let's say. There's more potential places you can sort of throw the male form to attempt something. Also probably more disposable as well, which I think history will show us. Sort of that simple, you know, hearty, ruddy, useful nature of it at the same time makes it not quite as precious and a little more disposable, hence the reason you send men first into conflict, because they're not as vital. Similarly, if we look at the sort of the masculine mindset, the masculine, I don't know, ethos, whatever that is, that idea of masculinity, it also is very simple, direct, and useful, but when pointed in the right direction, right? The masculine mindset is kind of this like, oh, okay, I'll just keep moving forward, right? But the problem is you got to sort of set that keep moving forward in the right direction. And if it's not aimed in the right direction, that sort of masculine, I'm gonna keep going and accomplish this thing, it can do some pretty negative things too, right? Because all it's doing is going forward, but it doesn't, the masculine mindset does not think so much about the compass heading. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right.
I want to add one more thing to that, because don't forget the potential for it to remain unformed.
Oh, right. Yeah.
There's no shortage of men who are not living up to potential. I mean, this is why we see.
Well, I think that's because they haven't been put in the right context, in the right direction. They are a pile of 2x4s waiting for someone to put them someplace.
Exactly. So the possibility of men remaining unformed is very, very present.
Yes.
So this is why you see this. It's somehow, and might step into controversial territory, but that's all right. This is likely one.
I think that's what we have to do around these verses.
Yeah, I guess this is likely potentially one of the reasons you see school performance, university attendance, and really just general capacity. Women tend to far outpace men
in those things,
especially nowadays.
Yeah.
Yes, they tend to score better on tests. They tend to be around. I don't know about IQs, but they tend to be perform better. But somehow men tend to be CEOs of companies. And I know it's going to be an argument about nepotism and things like that. I would contend that no, those are a lot of times the men who have very narrowly focused and concentrated on one particular thing. And that's the only thing they're focused on.
Yeah. And I mean, in Scandinavia,
in that particular direction.
Right. In Scandinavia, where they've taken the most measures to sort of mitigate those things which are often here in the US blamed as the reason there aren't as many women in those certain positions. In fact, the differences became greater, right?
Exactly.
Perhaps because of the interest and the idea of women generally. Again, women have both a masculine and feminine side. Men have both a masculine and feminine side. It's just that generally women are more feminine and men more masculine. Generally, that's not always the case, though. As we've talked about with the comparison between me and the Russian babushka in 1843 or something. Yeah. But kick my butt, that's for sure.
I think it's significant to show that there's this gathering at the top, maybe in terms of masculinity, but also at the bottom.
Yes.
That the majority of homeless are men, the majority of suicides are men, and as you pointed out, the majority killed in war are men. Mm-hmm. And so there's this formed and unformed difference that you see, where it's like, you got to roll the dice, and either you're sitting at top or you're sitting at the very, very bottom a lot of times in terms of hyper masculinity.
Yes.
And so that's important to recognize when it comes to forming, the potential for not being formed, but also the potential for being hyper formed and completely driven and pushed.
Yep.
So yeah, we could move on, I guess. But
okay. On the other hand, so that's looking at sort of this first formed, shaped idea. On the other hand, something which is built, that's something which is sort of designed, engineered. It's designed for kind of not so much for broad application, but for kind of a specific purpose, right? And so it has a kind of powerfulness within this specific window of things, but not necessarily more broadly, right? If we think of something like a house or a building, first of all, it's interesting to note it is dependent upon wood, for its framing. So it puts the wood to use, right? It makes use of the wood. But the house is sort of more narrowly applicable than wood. It's a house. You put things in it, you do things in it, but you could use wood for fuel, right? Too. You don't just have to use it to build a house. You can use it for starting a fire and cooking food. You could use it to create a cart for transportation and to move stuff around. There's a million uses for wood, right? Build a ship with it, whatever, right? So it's it's like it's something that is greater than wood on its own, right? The house is, uh, be, because of its design for that specific purpose, right? And it's interesting that that design actually determines how the wood is used. House, boat, whatever the design is, whatever we're engineering, whatever we're building. So I think this reflects what we see again in female and in femininity, right? Female biology has much greater complexity, right? Which makes a lot of sense when we consider the whole, childbirth thing. That's going to have significantly increased complexity to that. That's a much more intricate thing, right? And especially when you consider the idea of feeding after childbirth too. That's like included in the whole package. It's really quite something. But women are generally not as strong as men, right? The form is not as broadly useful and applicable as men. But when it comes to the specifics of what is more or less the most important thing humans do, procreate, the male form is utterly useless, while the female form is perfection, right? So in that window where it's useful, there's nothing better. Also, the feminine mindset is incredibly.
Before we go to the feminine mindset, I just have one more biological point that I think is significant.
Sure.
in terms of women being sexual selectors in humans, because I think that as we talk about the unformed nature of masculinity and the built nature of femininity, there's this way in which women, broadly speaking, they can direct most of culture because they're the selectors. And so they will determine what the top of the peak is for men. So
yes, they will determine what makes sort of the most desirable individual.
Most desirable, yeah, for mating, I guess,
right.
to go full biological. So, I mean, why would men pursue aggressively a career that pays a lot of money? A lot of the times it's because it puts them in a higher position in terms of
sure.
sexual selection. Why would you pursue being the star athlete? There is something to the athletic endeavor and things like that, but a big portion of it is the sexual selection. And there's no shortage of comedic routines that take advantage of this and say that, look, all that men do is really they're just trying to get sex. That's the whole reason they do everything. And that's a joke, and it's funny, but it's also a joke because it's that bears.
There's an element of truth to it, of course.
And so what women determine to be attractive is what causes the majority of men to start pointing and directing towards. Right. They're going to start going in the directions based on what women are going to say, this is what we want, broadly speaking.
Yes.
And so that's I think really significant as you look between this unformed masculinity in the more biological sense, unformed masculine and the built feminine, is that the feminine really is designing more. And then the masculine's following and attempting to achieve whatever it is that the goal that they're setting.
And I want to highlight here, we're going to come back to in a second, at the individual level. So we'll come back to that in just a second. But
of course, you mean biologically, like
I mean, they are deciding what makes for a good individual man.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so, absolutely.
Well, I say that for a specific reason. We'll get to it in a second. So if we look at the sort of the feminine mindset, right? That is similarly incredibly complex, right? The masculine is kind of, it can sort of be boiled down to forward momentum, right? Like I said, it's got to be directed and said, go that direction. It can't just be the pile of 2x4s, but once you put up a piece of wood, it's going to stay there, like it lasts a real long time before it comes down. So that's sort of the masculine mindset, but it's actually the feminine mindset which gives direction, meaning, value, and sort of, and helps to rein in, right, the masculine aggression as well. Because again, push forward, but there's a point at which you can go too far with that pushing forward. History has no shortage of examples of that, though.
It's important to note you're switching between you're switching between talking about men and women at this point and switching between the
masculine and feminine.
I want to point that out. I know you were careful about your words there, but I think it's important to point that out.
No, I think there's no shortage of
now masculine versus feminine.
There's no shortage of the masculine instinct pushing too far throughout history.
Correct.
Right. That's what I would say. Okay. Here though, again, I want to point out, as you were kind of getting at, that we both have aspects of both the feminine and masculine. I find there to be kind of a very interesting symbolic demonstration in that there's a dependence upon the other, and that is symbolically actually shown in sort of what the male and female forms do best. And let's put it this way, right? So what the women, in order to give birth, rely heavily on actually their own masculine instinct, right? To sort of push through, to make it past that incredible, painful, difficult situation, right? And they rely on sort of this kind of masculine will, even though they are typically regarded as, again, in here, emblematic of the feminine form. In order to do the feminine thing or the female thing best, in order to do that female thing best requires a heavy dose of a masculine perspective, which is interesting to me. I think it shows the necessity of both, if you will, both perspectives. And then for men, they are largely the place in which men, the male sort of form, has had the most value or played the biggest role, which is the formation of societies. And I'll explain all this further in more detail in a second. To do that well requires one to call on sort of the feminine ability to kind of envision something that doesn't yet exist, right? And figure out, well, how do we craft it? How do we get there? How do we build it? That is that vision, right? That idea of taking something out of principles and sort of forming something to it, and what do we value in this thing we're designing, all of that. That is a very feminine thing. It's design, right? And the design is just a more feminine instinct. So again, I mean, in other words, for sort of the male form to be its most useful, it has to heavily rely on a feminine instinct in order to pull that off.
I have one addition to that. I would say that also women tend to be much, and we tend to associate more with the feminine EQ and capacity for understanding emotions and understanding complex social situations.
Right.
That's because women oftentimes like compete in social hierarchies more than they compete in external objective hierarchies.
Yep.
Like men create sports, and then they if they score more points, you objectively won. There you go,
right.
You're the winner. Right. Whereas it's more complex in the female realm because it's far more social. It's a different thing. However, if you want to attain, there's a masculine drive that, if we're attributing drive to that, I think, which is fair, to achieve the top of a particular area, a corporation or a government position, something like that. If it's just drive, you don't get where you want to go.
Nope.
It requires navigation of complex social situations and complex social hierarchies, which is the feminine. Yeah. And so there's a way in which, in order to achieve this thing that is considered the top of the masculine hierarchy, it requires an understanding of the feminine. So there's an integration of the two that's required in order. That's very interesting, right, to get over the hump of either of the two. That's really representative of what
right. And I imagine there might be some who would take issue with what I've just described here in terms of these sort of two roles. And I don't know that we have a time for sort of a full breakdown of it all. However, I think I can give a simple overview of why sort of I put those as the things which these two groups do, right? And that is because generally it has been women who create individuals and families. That's what women create, both in the form of birth as well as what you were talking about, right? The sexual selection and determining what makes for a individual man that is appealing, right? And so
and also look at the gestation period for
oh sure, yeah, no, yeah.
I mean, we have 9 months.
It's symbolically there, obviously.
And it makes sense why women are sexually selective, because a woman has to decide, who am I going to have that's going to protect me and make sure we're safe for the 9 months when I'm incapacitated physically. Yeah. It's like that makes sense why they would be in that position and would be having to being the judges, you know?
Right. And my point is, then even the fact that they carry children and that it is just in that one side is symbolically linked to this idea of women, and also sort of the female instinct, the two being the feminine instinct, the two being, you know, overlapping, not perfectly, but overlapping, is this idea that they are individually centered, right? Or small group, family, right? Centered. They are very narrowly centered. However,
and more attentive to emotions, more attentive
right. Well, all those things, all those things tie into the cultivation of individual, right? Yeah. The cultivation of individual in small groups. And men generally have been associated with cultivating larger social structures, right? It's not universal, and I'm not even suggesting it's always ideal. It's not necessarily. However, it is generally what has occurred, right? Many men may make better, family formers, and women better societal formers. It's not 100%, but in broad generalities, humans over the course of millennia seem to have discovered that this is generally what works best, right? Generally. And again, of course, even within the dynamics of what has happened and what does exist and should, and all of those things, of course, men and women have played roles in both parts, right? No family works well if there's no, male or masculine instinct or any of those things involved in the cultivation of the family, of the individuals. That needs to be there too, just as in the formation of society. There does need to be, the female as well can participate in that.
I would go one further.
I'm just speaking archetypically again.
Yeah, and I would go one further with the exceptions and say I think this is fairly true, and can be shown pretty reliably, at least in the female case, is that women who tend to attain the positions of prominence are oftentimes some of the most effective in those positions, because it could be because they've had to face the challenges to get there, but also because they have the opposite perspective and are able to balance a lot better. Right. So they might have that masculine drive, but then that they still do attain that femininity because it's ingrained in them. And so you look at rulers going from Margaret Thatcher to Queen Elizabeth to Queen Victoria to, you can go back to the Mongolian emperor and see some women who are really prominent in ruling there. It's very common to look and see the women who rule in history tend to be very, very effective. And I would say the opposite would be true. If you run into the rare circumstance of a single dad, they're typically effective. They're very, very effective because they're having to bring out that part of themselves that in order to meet the task that's before them. Yes. But then also retain some of the masculinity. And so an ideal situation is to have both involved. But if it's forced to be pushed into one individual, or if they're operating in a structure where it's different, they tend to be really effective.
That's true. Yeah. I mean, you look at, it's a mere matter of statistics, but obviously the absence of a father tends to lead more likely to crime than the absence of a mother. Weirdly, the absence of a mother results in a strange number of musicians. Paul McCartney, John Lennon, both their mothers died young. Bruce Springsteen, his mother died young. There's something about that, I guess, that triggers, sort of an artistic thing, I guess, or something in people. Maybe that's the case. I don't know. But yeah, there's
Mary Shelley, who's she wrote Frankenstein,
right?
She her mother died young.
Yes. Yeah.
Her mother was Mary Wollstonecraft.
Yeah.
She died young.
Yeah, she did as well. Yeah. So, yeah, and that again, that may be, like you said, just the other side sort of having to access that which doesn't come naturally for them. All right, so in wrapping up this episode, this verse, I think the difference of the descriptives, right, that we see used here, of man being formed, torn apart, and sewn back up, compared with woman being built, I think it does give us a real sense of the ways in which both man and woman are different, as well as the ways in which masculinity and femininity are different. I think it actually does apply to both. So, all right. With that, we're going to jump into Genesis 2:23 next episode. So be sure to like, subscribe, follow, all those things. Check the show notes and get on our mailing list. Rate the show if it's a podcast. It's one of the places you can do those kind of things, and share with a friend. Email us, unschooltheology@protonmail.com, and we will see you next time. Thanks.